Hey there folks, this is the first lesson in a series about music theory specifically for banjo players. And I gotta be honest, it's a little bit dense. It's all good information and it's all really useful information, but it's a lot of information. So here's what I suggest. Take a look at the video, but don't worry too much about memorizing everything that happens in this video and everything that I talk about. It's more that later in this series, when I talk about more fun stuff like scales and chords and improvisation, I want to be able to casually mention the stuff in this video without having to re-explain it over and over again. So you might already know some of the stuff in this video and you might learn something new, but my guess is that later in this series, you're going to come back to this video just as a refresher if I mention something that you don't know super well. It's really just about laying the groundwork for this stuff so we can talk about it in a logical and organized way. And we're starting really simple with tablature, but we get into the finer points of rhythm, stuff that you'll be seeing and counting and writing. So it's all good stuff to know. Anyway, that's just a short disclaimer for this lesson. Feel free to skip around in this video to find the stuff that you want to learn and know that you can always come back and check this out again in the future. Listen to this metronome. Think of each click of the metronome as one beat. A beat is the basic unit of time in music. When you tap your foot along to music, you're often tapping the beat of the music. We group these beats into even units called measures, which are separated in notation and tablature by these lines. For the time being, think of each measure as containing 4 beats. That's not always true, but it's often true in bluegrass, so it's a good place to start. In terms of note durations, let's start with the longest note we have, the whole note, which in this case lasts for an entire measure, or 4 beats. In tablature, it's often represented by a number with a circle around it. A common misconception is that a whole note means a whole measure, but it really just means a whole 4 beats. If a measure only has 3 beats, as we'll see later, then a whole note will not fit within the measure. Counting and playing a whole note is easy. All you have to do is play the note once and count 1, 2, 3, 4. This is somewhat rare in bluegrass banjo, but it's worth knowing nonetheless. Along with notating notes that are played, we also have to notate spaces where notes aren't played. This is called a rest. A whole rest, in fact. It means that you don't play anything for a whole 4 beats. You would count it the same as a whole note, but without playing anything. After the whole note is the half note, which is unsurprisingly half the length of a whole note. Half of 4 is 2, so a half note lasts for 2 beats, and 2 half notes will fit in one measure. A half note is generally represented by a circle around the number with a line under it. To count and play a measure of half notes, you'll just play at the beginning of each note and count 1, 2, 3, 4. A half note rest looks similar to a whole note rest, but with the black rectangle on top of the 3rd string instead of under the 2nd string. We'll continue this trend with the quarter note, which is, you guessed it, 1/4 the length of a whole note and is represented by a line beneath the fret number. The quarter note is easy because it's just one note for each beat in the measure. That means you play and count at the same time. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is a quarter rest, which is counted just like a quarter note, but without playing anything. Continuing on, we have the 8th note, probably the most common note duration that you'll see in banjo tablature. It is, as you might have guessed, 1/8 the duration of a whole note, so you can fit 8 of them in one measure. 8th notes are generally represented with a line beneath the fret number, but with what's called a flag extending from that line. However, you'll usually see 8th notes connected together in groups of 2, 3, or 4, depending on the rhythm being played and the notation conventions of the publisher or the software being used. When it comes to counting the 8th note, we have a bit of a challenge. There are 8 8th notes in a measure, so we could just count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? Well, not really, because then we'll be sacrificing the placement of the beat, 1, 2, 3, 4. We want to protect the basic beat of the music so we'll have a clear idea of where we are. So instead of counting to 8, we're going to add the word "and" in between each number. This way, beats 1, 2, 3, and 4 remain in the same place, and we have a way of quickly and easily counting what occurs in between them. That will sound like this: 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and. With 8th notes, we generally consider the numbers to be on the beat and the ands to be the offbeat or upbeat. When rhythms include large amounts of notes on offbeats, we call that syncopation. And this is what an 8th note rest looks like, though when you have multiple 8th note rests, you don't connect them in the same way that you do with 8th notes. Now let's take it another step further with 16th notes, half the length of an eighth note and 1/16th the length of a whole note. They look somewhat like eighth notes, but with an extra flag. When connected, they look like eighth notes with an extra horizontal line. Again, we have a challenge in counting these notes because not only do we have to account for more notes than we have syllables, but these notes occur quickly relative to the other notes we've already looked at. The most common way to count these remaining syllables is with E and ah placed after each number and respectively. Now we can quickly and easily count a measure of 16th notes by saying 1 eanda, 2 eanda, 3 eanda, 4 eanda. This system allows us to easily pronounce the syllables we need to count the material, but its real value lies in the fact that you can see each note duration at this level. Obviously, this is how we count 16th notes, but includes the syllables for eighth notes and quarter notes as well, which means even when counting shorter note durations or complicated combinations of rhythms, we'll be maintaining a connection to the strong beats of the music, which is ultimately how we tend to feel the music and hear the music. However, here's where the system breaks down. 30-second notes. Yes, there are 30-second notes, and 64th notes, and 128th notes, but 30-second notes are really the shortest note duration that actually gets used, even if very, very rarely. Conceptually, it's not such a big deal. So far, all we've done is split the notes in half, and that's exactly what we're doing here. But counting 30-second notes is a problem. Some people will count each beat twice, meaning 1 eanda, 2 eanda, 2 eanda, and so on. And some people will count just every other note as if they were counting 16th notes and play 2 notes per spoken syllable. And I don't really like either of these methods of counting 30-second notes, and I haven't really found a good way around that, so I just tend to not use 30-second notes when I write things, which might sound a little bit confusing, but for reasons that you'll see later, there are different ways we can write things to make it a little clearer and easier to read. So you can use 30-second notes, but I don't really think it's the best idea. Before we move on to more complicated rhythmic concepts or apply this to bluegrass banjo tablature, I think it would be a good idea to just look at some simple rhythms and apply this information in a way that we can internalize it, but also analyze what we see on the page. So in this first example, the first note we see is a half note, which we know is 2 beats. So it might be a good idea to label that as 1, 2. Then there's a quarter note, which we know is 1 beat, and we can label that as 3. After the quarter note on beat 3, we have 2 eighth notes, the first of which falling on beat 4. So we can label that 4 and. This is really all about adding up to 4 full beats. So as long as you know which note duration lasts for which amount of time, you should be able to put this together with a somewhat simple math equation. Just see if it all adds up to 4 beats in the end. Then once you have everything labeled, you can try to count and play this example. 1, 2, 3, 4, and. In this next example, we start with a quarter note, which is 1 beat, so we can label that 1, followed by 2 eighth notes, which is taking up beat 2, so we can label that as 2 and. Then we have another quarter note, which would be beat 3, followed by 2 more eighth notes, beat 4, 4 and. So in terms of counting and then playing this example, it would sound like this. 1, 2 and 3, 4 and. In this final example, we start in the same way that we started our last example, with a quarter note on beat 1, 2 eighth notes on beat 2, but then we have a group of 4 16th notes which takes up the entirety of beat 3, followed by a quarter note on beat 4. So here's how you would count and play this example. 1, 2, and 3 and 4. Anyway, those are really all the standard note durations that you're going to see when it comes to bluegrass banjo, but there are some other markings, some ways that we can modify those notes to change their duration that you're probably going to want to know about. The first is a dot. A dot is added next to a note, and the duration is thereby increased by 1/2 of the original note's duration. If that was a little confusing, think about it this way. A half note is 2 beats. Half of that is 1 beat. So you add 1 to 2, and you get 3 beats. So a dotted half note is 3 beats. A quarter note is 1 beat. Half of that is 1/2 or an eighth note. So if you add an eighth note to a quarter note, you'll get 1.5 beats. A dotted quarter note is 1.5 beats. The dot is used to describe notes that don't otherwise have a standard note length symbol. So a dotted half note exists because there's no standard symbol for a note with 3 beats. A dot can be applied in this way to any of the standard note durations, but it's somewhat rare in banjo tablature. Another way to extend the duration of a note is to tie 2 notes together. A tie simply connects 2 notes, adding their durations. One common use of the tie is to connect 2 notes over a bar line, so that, for instance, a quarter note at the end of one measure and a quarter note at the beginning of another measure can be connected. To count and play these measures, you simply play the first tied note and count through the second tied note. In this example, you would start playing on beat 4 and count 4, 1. However, ties are also used within a measure to make it clear exactly where each beat lies. These 2 examples show exactly the same rhythmic pattern written in 2 different ways. In the first example, there is an 8th note on the and of 1. That's what you'd call it, the and of 1, tied to an 8th note on beat 2. The tied notes equal 1 full beat. In the second example, there's a quarter note starting on the and of 1, which also equals 1 full beat. Notice that in the first example, each beat is still clear to the eye. There is a slightly more complicated notation when we connect the notes, but the underlying rhythm of the music is clearer, and you can count each beat and subdivision. In the second example, we're using simple notation, but the underlying beat is gone. It's not clear exactly where beat 2 is. Of course, this really only matters in written music. Musicians don't tend to think about this while playing, but it's an example of how something a little more complicated can actually give a more meaningful result in written music. Of course, written music isn't actually music, it's just a visual representation of it, but as long as we're doing that, we should probably try to represent it well. The final modifier we'll look at is the triplet, which actually makes our standard note durations shorter. A triplet is a group of 3 notes which takes the place of 2 notes. Quarter note triplets take place in the span of 2 quarter notes. 8th note triplets take place in the span of 2 8th notes. An important thing to keep in mind is that each note in the triplet is the same length. A triplet is not any group of 3 notes, it is specifically a group of 3 equal notes taking place in the span of 2 equal notes. One common method of counting triplets is to use the syllables trip-a-let with 1 syllable per note. And one of the big challenges with triplets, for most people anyway, is that all of a sudden now we're dividing up these different units of time into groups of 3 instead of groups of 2. So it wouldn't really surprise me if that wasn't the easiest thing for you to count through and play accurately. One technique to practice a triplet is to alternate between measures of, for instance, quarter notes and quarter note triplets. 1, 2, 3, 4. Trip-a-let, trip-a-let. 1, 2, 3, 4. Trip-a-let, trip-a-let. Doing the same thing with 8th notes and 8th note triplets would sound like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and triplet, 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 triplet. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and triplet, 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 triplet. And with all that information, the note durations and the different modifiers, you have all the information you need to count through basically all bluegrass banjo tablature. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can play it all right now, but you can interpret what's on the written page and figure out what it's supposed to sound like. But to get really comfortable with this stuff, you're going to want to practice it. So let's try applying some of this stuff to actual music. Let's look at, for instance, Cumberland Gap as an example. One way that we can start to understand how all of these rhythms line up is to just write all of our symbols underneath one measure and see which ones we'll actually need to play these notes. When we take away all the syllables we don't need, we're left with this. Then we can actually count the measure and see how it should sound. 1E and 2 and 3, 4. You won't have to do this every time you look at tablature, but the option is always there when you're having trouble deciphering a passage or measure. Hey folks, real quick interruption. Just thought I'd mention that if you're enjoying this video, feel free to subscribe to this channel and like this video. That's a huge thing that you can do to help me make more of these videos. So if you do that, I really appreciate it. Also, feel free to check out patreon.com/EliGilbertBanjo, which is where I post all the bonus content that you can't find here on YouTube, like backup tablature and practice tips. For instance, with this lesson, you'll get a more in-depth video about counting through some of these tunes, like Cumberland Gap, for instance. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, then check it out. Anyway, back to the rest of the video. So now we know when to play each of these notes and how long they should last. But how do we know how fast the entire piece of music should be? This is defined by the tempo marking, which, as you'll see here, is quarter note equals 80. That means 80 quarter notes per minute, which might not mean a lot to you right now, but if you were to take a metronome and set it to 80 beats per minute, that would be the rate at which you play quarter notes. So for quarter note equals 80, if you set your metronome to 80 and count quarter notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, then you have a point of reference for your entire piece of music. Sometimes you'll also see eighth note equals 80 or eighth note equals whatever number the tempo is. It doesn't really matter which note is being used, but that's going to be your frame of reference for the rest of the piece of music. Now that's all well and good, but we're actually missing a big part of the picture when it comes to rhythm. Remember when I told you before that each measure has 4 beats? Well, that's not always true. It's true very often in bluegrass, but not always. The number of beats in a measure is determined by the time signature, this fraction-like symbol that you'll find at the beginning of most tablature and notated music. Except it's not a fraction and shouldn't be interpreted as such. In this case, the top number in the time signature tells you how many beats are in each measure. The bottom number tells you which type of note equals 1 beat. So, a 4/4 time signature tells us that there are 4 beats in each measure and that a quarter note is equal to 1 beat. Another common time signature is 3/4, which means that there are 3 beats in each measure, and 2/4, which means that there are 2 beats in each measure, both where the quarter note equals 1 beat. But in theory, there could be any number of beats in a measure. These time signatures are known as simple time signatures. Another type of time signature, which is all but non-existent in banjo tablature, is the compound time signature. These time signatures generally have an 8 as the bottom number, but that doesn't actually mean that the 8th note is 1 beat. In compound time signatures, the beat is often a group of 3 notes, which is the bottom number, so in this case, an 8th note. So in 6/8, there are 6 eighth notes, which when grouped together form 2 beats. In 9/8, there are 3 groups of 3 notes, so there are 3 beats, and in 12/8, there are 4 groups of 3 notes, so there are 4 beats. However, we probably don't need to spend any more time on this for now because it occurs so rarely in bluegrass banjo tablature. Something you will see, however, is tablature written in 2/4 instead of 4/4. These two examples will sound exactly the same, even though they appear different. Notice that in the first example, the tempo marking is quarter note equals 80, and in the second example, the tempo marking is eighth note equals 80. This means that a quarter note in the first example is going to sound the same as an eighth note in the second example. It's really just a matter of relativity. It's kind of like fractions. 1/2 and 2/4 and 3/6. They're all the same. They're all 1/2, but we're just looking at them in different ways. However, I happen to really dislike this method because of the 30-second notes. Because we don't have a convenient way to count 30-second notes, it severely limits the value of written notation. Beyond that, it tends to look more cluttered with what I think is unnecessary ink on the page. And here's how I really think about this 4/4 versus 2/4 thing. It really is the same. You can even see that the notes line up. It's just that the 2/4 example looks like it's being played twice as fast because the notes are half the length, except you're playing the entire section half as fast. The tempo is slower, but the notes are shorter. It's really, I promise, the same thing, just written differently. So it might be that the 2/4 example is actually easier for you to comprehend and get you closer to actually playing the music. But for me, and I think for most people, the top example, based mostly in eighth notes, is generally easier to look at. But it doesn't surprise me that some people really like the 2/4 example because that's kind of what bluegrass banjo sounds like sometimes. Bluegrass banjo rolls actually tend to sound more like 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a than 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, right? Well, all of this stuff, the written language of music versus what you're actually playing and hearing, it's really just a concept. So it kind of depends on how you think about it. The music that you're actually trying to play is not what's written on the page, but depending on how you interpret what's written on the page, you're going to play something slightly different. So even though I prefer 4/4 written in eighth notes, I'm trying to hear what the music should actually sound like, which has a lot more to do with the music that I listen to and whether or not I listen to the music that's written on the page. It's not just on the page, it's usually based on real music that you can actually listen to. So if you ever feel like you're a little bit disconnected from the music by reading things or thinking about things analytically or theoretically, well, don't let me stop you from actually just going to listen to the music because that's what the real music is. It's the thing you listen to. But we do sometimes actually have to write this stuff down. That can be really helpful too. So I find it really helpful to be aware of the different ways that people write these things down so that I know how to interpret it if I really have to. It's not that people think about this stuff while they're playing music. It's really more that they have a lot of experience with rhythm, either analytical or not. Usually some combination of both. And well, this is a video about music theory, so as long as we're going down that road, we might as well analyze some of this stuff and find a way to talk about it. But we don't ever want to forget that this is really about playing music, which doesn't really end up being analytical in the moment. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure you subscribe to this channel, like this video, check out patreon.com/EliGilbertBanjo. And that's going to do it for this one. I'll see you next time.